This video will focus on the conflict on the plains between 1862 and 1864. It will principally focus on the two wars on the plains in this period. Little Crow's War, or the Dakota War as it's otherwise known, and the Colorado War, of which the most notable event that you need to know about for the specification is the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. So as we move into the 1860s, there's an increase in white settlements onto the plains itself, and this is having a big impact on the Plains Indians. The railroads are beginning to expand into the west. That was one of the legacies of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, obviously. And the expansion of the railroad disrupted buffalo migration, grazing, and obviously was problematic for the Native Americans. There's a significant influx of gold miners. Discoveries of gold in Colorado and Montana bring huge numbers of new settlers, which further disrupt buffalo hunting. And the Bozeman Trail was established through the hunting grounds of the Lakota Sioux, which caused conflicts leading to the Bozeman War, or Red Cloud's War, in 1866. And the cattle industry is expanding as well. There's a massive explosion of the cattle industry. We've got the beef bonanza. It's reducing the grass available for grazing for buffalo. We see some Native Americans kind of giving up their old ways and going off to work as cowboys. The US Army was also involved in protecting cattle trails, sometimes against perceived hostility from Native Americans. So what we see is that the US government starts to shift its policy from what they had said they would do in the Fort Laramie Treaty. In the Fort Laramie Treaty, they said that the Plains Indians would not lose any more land, that they'd be protected from attack by whites and be given yearly payments, annuities in money, but also sometimes in food or livestock or clothing or whatever. However, the US government often did not keep its promises. Now, reservation life, we know that by this time we've got the reservations kind of beginning, and reservations are not terribly nice places for these Native Americans at all. Living conditions was often incredibly poor. There were big problems with an inability to grow crops because the land wasn't good. The Indians weren't skilled farmers anyway. Big problems with the illness, alcoholism, depression, significant problems around that. The US government also, and this is kind of later on, would take control of the reservations. They removed the power of Indian councils. They bribed Plains Indians to work on the Indian police to try to make the Indians police each other. Christian missionaries were sent in to try to convert Native Americans to Christianity. And some Plains Indians' children were even taken and sent off to schools off the reservation. And if the parents refused to send them, the food was cut off. And the idea being there to kill the Indian in these children in order to save them out. Again, this was a genocide. There's no other way around it. This made life obviously incredibly difficult for the Plains Indians. Now, in 1868, at the end of this period, we'll see the President Ulysses Grant implement the peace policy, which he puts in place in order to kind of change course. This is really after the failure of the Bozeman War, or Red Cloud's War. The US government doesn't do very well in that conflict. We see changes to the policies. We see an American Indian man, Eli Parker, appointed as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. We see reservation agents being replaced by Quakers in order to try to calm tensions down. But there was also the Indian Appropriations Act of 1871 that said that tribes were not to be treated as sovereign nations anymore, which made it easier for the government to take land from the Plains Indians and give it to settlers. Now, you need to know about three key conflicts in the 1860s, as you can see there. I'll deal with the Red Cloud's War in the next video. We're just going to focus on Little Crow's War and the Sand Creek Massacre for now. What you need to know is sort of an outline of the story of each of the conflicts. Why did they start? What happened? And what was the outcome? There are some things in common. The diagram here shows you that there were a number of themes to these conflicts. We see treaties being signed, not necessarily all of the Plains Indian tribes being represented. We see white settlers breaking the terms of the treaty in some way. We see warfare breaking out. We see the US Army coming in usually to protect the white settlers and not the Plains Indians, even though the treaty was being broken against the Plains Indians. And the US Army obviously using their superior firepower most of the time to defeat the Plains Indians and forcing the Plains Indians tribes to sign worse treaties, which deprived them of their rights and land even further. There's a whole series of conflicts on the plains that you need to know about, and this map just shows you where they are and what the sort of geographic location of these conflicts. We're going to focus, as I say, in this video on Little Crow's War first of all, and then the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. So with Little Crow's War, or otherwise known as the Dakota War of 1862, this starts because the US government failed to keep up its payments to the Dakota Sioux, the Dakota Eastern Dakota tribe, the Santee Sioux as they're otherwise known, that they were owed by the Fort Laramie Treaty. And these Sioux, these are based up in Minnesota, so this is right up in the north of the United States, on the eastern edge of the plains. The Santee Sioux have a problem in 1861. There's a massive cutworm infestation that devastates their corn crops, and the government doesn't pay the annuity. So what happens is that the credit that the American Indians received at the government store up in this area of Minnesota, the credit for the Plains Indians was stopped. And this led to the threat of violence, and we see 4 Santee Sioux murder 5 settlers in 1862, and this kind of triggers conflict between the two sides. Little Crow is the leading figure. He leads an attack on the Indian Agency, which kills 20. They capture 10 women and children, and there's a series of ambushes by the Santee Sioux against the US Army forces. Bear in mind, this is 1862, the Civil War's going on. The US Army in Minnesota is not in its strongest position at this time. Fighting continued on and off until September. Little Crow's men tried to capture Fort Ridgely and New Ulm, but failed to do so. And the violence continues. And basically what we see is the US government escalates the response. They send the army in to deal with the problem, and they overwhelm really the Indian forces. Little Crow escapes off west with some of his followers. We see 303 Santee Sioux were sentenced to death. 38 were actually executed. This was an order signed by President Abraham Lincoln to execute 38 of these Native Americans. This is the largest mass execution in US history. The remainder of the Santee Sioux were transferred to a new Crow Creek reservation elsewhere in Minnesota. The land was very poor quality. 400 died there in the first winter. Sitting Bull, one of the leading figures of the Lakota, visited during this time and was affected really by the hardship imposed on the natives, and that perhaps influenced him in some of his actions later on in the 1870s. So, and this was, as I say, a very serious situation, and the murder of the execution of these Sioux Indians was a highly controversial event indeed. Now, the other conflict you need to know about is the Sand Creek Massacre. Now, this takes place in the southern plains. So, if I get back to my original map here, we've got Little Crow's War up over in the northeastern area of the plains. The Sand Creek Massacre, miles and miles away down in the south, and this involves the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. In 1859, gold had been discovered at Pikes Peak in Colorado. This led to a massive gold rush to Colorado, and conflict, unsurprisingly, between the settlers and the Plains Indians because the land that the miners arrived in was land designated as belonging to the Plains Indians under the Fort Laramie Treaty. These miners were not allowed to settle in this land, and yet they were creating mining settlements that were damaging, particularly to the buffalo herds. So the US government negotiated the Treaty of Fort Wise, which this would give the Cheyenne and Arapaho a smaller reservation area without hunting territory. They'd be expected to follow the sort of way of life of the white Americans. Only some of the tribal leaders signed that treaty, and fighting began in 1864. The Dog Soldiers, a group of Native Americans, one of the bands of the Cheyenne, were one of the groups who opposed the treaty and engaged in hostilities against the US Army. This all built up then to the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, where 150 Plains Indians, men, women, and children were murdered and mutilated in a brutal attack led by Colonel John Chivington of the US Army. This was a vicious event. Just to give you an idea of the kind of man we're talking about with Colonel Chivington, he said, "Damn any man who sympathises with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honourable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice." Be clear that, I think if really we were talking about any other society, we'd have no problem saying that this was a genocide, which it absolutely is. I think just the fact that it's the United States involved, maybe people feel differently about that, but we shouldn't. This was a brutal, mass slaughter of defenseless people. Chivington went out with the express purpose of killing large numbers of Indians. The Indians obviously retaliated, a number of attacks. There was an attack on the Julesburg settlement, which was burnt down. Fighting continued through 1865. Ultimately, a treaty was signed in 1865 between the two sides, but the US government would then backtrack on it because after 1865, the Civil War's over. They can send more forces to the west to deal with the Indians, and the Plains Indians are forced to sign an inferior treaty, the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867, where they're basically told either move to Indian territory, to what's now Oklahoma, or be treated as hostile. Again, many of the Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs signed the treaty, but not all agree. Black Cattle was one of those. He doesn't agree, and he's one of the leading Indian figures in this period, and he's involved in an attack on in a battle with the US Army, the Battle of Washita in 1868, which involved not general at that time, but it involved George Custer and his 7th Cavalry Division. Black Cattle was killed by Custer in that battle, and the Indians were defeated. More than 50 Cheyenne women and children taken by the US Army as hostages. And ultimately, the Colorado War ends in a significant defeat for the Cheyenne and Arapaho. As we see, the Fort Laramie Treaty did very little to stem the conflict between the US and the Plains Indians. The United States repeatedly failed to uphold the treaty obligations they committed to. The US government tried a range of strategies to subdue the Plains Indians, but these did not succeed in stopping the outbreak of open warfare. And the wars of this period have a number of commonalities, including the failure of the US government to uphold their treaties and the use of considerable brutality from the US towards those Plains Indians tribes.